Is that good?
Yes. All right, so let's begin. Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Sean O'Grady. I'm an economics and finance student from Catholic University, and I'm joined by Vincent Pham and Jamal Gauthier, who are both business school students studying management and finance respectively, along with Elizabeth Noe, who is also studying economics. And we're today representing the Goldfinch Partners organization, which is hoping to create a platform on which Facebook, you as the board of Facebook, can implement new programs and expertise within your ethical standards of data analytics. This is specifically looking at consumer privacy and the ethical usage of consumer data, as Facebook has dealt with for years now. And we hope to implement this program starting now until as long as it needs to go. So without further ado, let's begin.
Thank you, Sean. So we believe that the manner in which companies conduct the usage, collection, and storage of consumer data is a large concern for many consumers in today's world. And at Goldfinch Partners, we really feel that winning companies will have a societal responsibility to ensure to consumers that they're proactively serving as stewards of data privacy protection. So to start, when you look at the evolution of the internet and technology, we've observed that commercial entities such as Facebook have enjoyed an ever-increasing ability to access and make use of consumer data. Facebook itself has been one of the most innovative businesses of the 21st century, and they've been able to rise to the top by providing their customers and consumers with some of the best experiences to date. But as a tool to assist in the creation of these new experiences, Facebook has not shied away from using consumer data. In 2019 alone, Facebook's revenue amounted to $70.7 billion US dollars, up from $55.8 billion US dollars in the previous fiscal year. And the main source of Facebook's income has been through digital advertising, with private customer data being utilized by Facebook's various advertising partners. So the point we really want to bring home is, as the issue of consumer privacy with business continues to become more and more scrutinized, consumers are going to expect companies like Facebook to step up. Stricter data governance around the world has already forced many companies to rethink business models and reevaluate their business strategies around the world. We've seen huge scandals such as Facebook's with Facebook's with Cambridge Analytica, and huge events such as GDPR, which are really putting an increased spotlight on the issue of consumer privacy. So we believe that Facebook needs to be one of these companies strongly considering their role to play in the digital era.
All right, thank you, Jamal. And as Jamal stated, one of the most important aspects which has happened in the last several years in terms of privacy and consumer data for Facebook was the Cambridge Analytica scandal. This scandal, as the board of Facebook, you are well aware that it resulted in millions of lost, revenue and also lost users, as well as paying of fines to multiple government entities. Essentially what Cambridge Analytica was doing, as it was a British consultancy firm specializing in data analytics and kind of storage from Facebook's main components. And it was taking that data and unethically, it was processing it, studying it, selling it to third parties, and that sort of thing. But the problem that we are addressing here at Goldfinch Partners is we want to make sure that those ethical dimension issues don't become a problem for Facebook itself. And we believe that without something like Cambridge Analytica, Facebook would be stronger than ever in terms of being able to see those roadblocks up ahead and be able to kind of divert the path away from companies like Cambridge Analytica. As stated, there was millions lost. There was about 80 million Facebook users that were directly affected by this, with millions more who ended their usage of Facebook because of their fear about how their data was being used, as well as a $5 billion settlement with the Federal Trade Commission due to violations brought by both Facebook and Cambridge Analytica for the use of consumer data.
So one response to the concerns that consumers have about their privacy was the GDPR, which was implemented by the EU on May 25th in 2018. So it basically had wide sweeping effects on companies that operated in the EU, and Facebook, of course, was one of the companies that was affected by this. So as you know, you've already been adjusting some of your how you treat data and data privacy in order to comply with the GDPR. But the main reason that it was implemented was for the protection of natural persons with regard to the processing of personal data and on the free movement of such data. So this is kind of a stricter guideline that's been implemented by the EU government. And then after this, we'll also be addressing how the US is looking to respond to such concerns by consumers.
So as my colleague Elizabeth just said, in May 2018, new rules went into effect in Europe about consumers using and collecting personal data. So Akamai Research, a European country, actually polled consumers from this, so Europeans, and asked them what their opinion was on these new laws and new restrictions. The large majority of them, 66%, said that more governments should actually pass such laws. So the consumer was largely in favor of passing these laws. Another important thing to note is 6% of those polled thought that these laws may be too hard on businesses. Later on in the presentation, I'm going to tell you why these laws are not too hard on businesses. So on the flipping from the European to the American side, this is important because Facebook, one of their target markets is America. So that's where we're focusing on it. So Americans are concerned and confused over their data collection, and they feel as if they have a lack of control over where their data is going and how it's being collected. And according to research conducted by the Pew Research Center, 60% of Americans believe it is impossible to go through their daily life without their data being tracked. Why do they feel this way? Americans feel this way because the average American actually spends 3.5 hours per day using Wi-Fi on the internet, whether that's through their smartphone, through a laptop, through a tablet. In 2021, it's expected to go up to 4 hours. So you can see how this is an increasing issue as the world is increasingly digitized and people spend more time online. The bottom line is Americans feel as if they have little control over their personal data and the collection of it, and they feel as if it's less secure than ever. And this was brought to the forefront, as my colleague Sean said, with the Cambridge Analytica scandal. So pulling that thread back a little bit, what kinds of data are they concerned about keeping private? So Americans are mainly concerned, this is also from Akamai Research on Americans, Americans are mainly concerned about financial data. This is no surprise. As the world's becoming increasingly digitized, more Americans are accessing their bank accounts online, they're cashing their checks online, they're using new brokers online, such as Robinhood, and their financial data is at risk, and they really want to keep it secure. Next is account passwords at 26%. Whether this is a product such as Amazon or eBay where they're selling something to you, or a service such as Netflix, people want their passwords to be secure, to keep their purchases secure, and other things. Number 3, number 4 are private conversations and medical history. People also want to keep those private and to themselves.
So to kind of give some background on the definition of privacy in the law in the US as of right now. So there's no clearly defined right to privacy in the US Constitution. There are a few amendments which the Supreme Court has kind of used to read an implied right to privacy. And then there were a few more court cases where they kind of expanded this for individuals and their property. But more recently, as we have gone into a more digitized age, there have been a few court cases to address the issue of data privacy. And the most recent was Riley v. California, a court case in 2014 that got a lot of attention, which basically determined that the personal data that's on someone's cell phone is not accessible to law enforcement without a warrant. So potential outcomes could be stricter privacy laws, especially as there's more growing concern and potentially more court cases brought before the Supreme Court. And so this kind of gives a way for Facebook to kind of jump on a little earlier before there might potentially be more costly laws to address these issues. And one body that kind of addresses issues with how data is used in the US is the FTC. So they deal with particularly unfair or deceptive acts and practices in data management. And according to the FTC, unfair use of data is anything that causes or is likely to cause substantial injury to consumers, which cannot be reasonably avoided by consumers themselves and are not outweighed by countervailing benefits to consumers or to competition. So as of now, this doesn't necessarily reach into how Facebook uses people's data for things like ad revenue and things like this. But there is the potential that it could kind of head that way as there's more and more growing concern with consumer data.
And the key takeaways from those last two slides are that this is a relatively new phenomenon where consumers are actually concerned about their data, particularly in the last 5 to 10 years as we spend more and more time online. So what we're trying to do is establish some sort of case precedent for the legal issues involved with data collection.
Thanks, Elizabeth and Vincent. So it's clear at this point that consumers definitely do care about privacy based upon the figures presented by my colleague Vincent and the past precedent of court cases presented by Elizabeth. So that in a nutshell, consumers are kind of showing their mandate for heightened privacy measures in the United States. So when you look at the short run outlook, we've observed that Facebook's kind of in a quandary right now about the issue of data privacy. We've seen that Facebook has been made to step up because of the burden of compliance brought about by the GDPR. And this in itself has already forced Facebook to kind of reconsider some of its internal measures for dealing with the issue of consumer privacy. Another thing to note is the issue of compliance for GDPR. Compliance usually is a very expensive and a very confusing process for many companies that don't possess the infrastructure or the capital to deal with regulation. But the good thing about Facebook is that it's not one of those companies. Facebook already has the financial security net that'll help them overcome any temporary financial setbacks. So with that in mind, Facebook is already kind of forced in the short term to manage increasing calls for privacy, heightened privacy measures. The long run. So we believe that the companies that are the most successful, they're going to be the ones that take the issue of data governance and data security much more seriously. And the companies that truly care for their consumers and not just say that they do, but prove that they do, they'll be the ones that will implement more robust policies for privacy. And at Goldfinch Partners, we understand that unhappy consumers in the long run will lead to less business for Facebook. So my colleague Sean, in a little bit, will recommend a solution for Facebook that satisfies the company's need for heightened privacy measures.
So before we dive into the DOME system, my colleague Elizabeth talked about the why is it important with the legal issues. Sean will talk about the what with the DOME system. This is the how, the implementation, how it actually work. So the first step, it's not a cycle because after the second step, it can go in a multitude of places. The first step would be the government, which actually is a downside. They would have to give tax breaks to companies with a certain score, or companies they hope to obtain a certain score. So Facebook would be the initial company that they would give a tax break to. From there, Facebook would bear the initial burden of documentation and selling data to reputable companies. This means they actually have to know what data is being collected and where it's going, if it is going to third parties at all. From there, it can go anywhere, but the benefits for the government side are they have more control over the internet. We've seen this become an increasing issue in the last 2 years for the argument over the free internet, whether it should remain free or not, whether internet speed should be throttled with certain websites. The second benefit for the government is allows the government to track data, whether that's for criminal records or any sort of economic trends they want to figure out, and other things. The third benefit to the government is by giving companies tax breaks, that company will actually help stimulate the economy. What does that mean? That means that the government is actually choosing who effectively will be the winners, or who's going to have what market share for what industry. We're seeing this right now with the coronavirus, with the government selecting which airline industries they're going to bail out. So they're effectively choosing the winners in that sense. The benefits for Facebook, obviously the first one's going to be tax breaks. That's the solid foundation this is built upon. The second, it provides a point of advertising. This means that both consumers and other companies are more likely to work with Facebook because they know they're reputable in using our DOME system. Third is that more people are more likely to trust the company, which also means an increased user base, as well as a potential stock boost to the stock price. The downsides for the consumer is that the government actually has more say over the internet, but the benefits outweigh the downsides. The consumers know where their data is going, and both governments and companies are motivated to act in the consumer's best interest. The key takeaway from the slide is that this system is upheld by incentives, because you don't need legislation per se if you have incentives. So by implying some sort of incentives combined with subsidiarity, you can have this sort of self-regulating system. The last key takeaway from this slide is that through the consumer benefits, you can see that people are being placed over profit, and people are being treated as an end in themselves, not as a means to an end.
So I'm sure you on the board are aware of how the processing of data works, but I'm just going to quickly run through that so we can understand how and where in this process we're going to be implementing our system. So the collection of consumer data is the first step in this process. This happens for Facebook when users log in and start providing personal data about themselves on their profiles or in apps that are linked in with Facebook. The next step in this is the storage phase. So Facebook receives so much information on their users that they cannot themselves store all of this data. So that's when they go out of house to another company to help store all the data that they're receiving. And at this point, this is where we'll be implementing our self-regulating DOME system, which we'll get to right after this. So after this stage, this is where the information can be sold to third parties to utilize this for ad revenue, political campaigns or lobbying, insurance, etc. And this goes back out and is received by consumers. So quickly going through the DOME system, there are going to be 5 tenets for the DOME system. First, responsibility. Second, transparency. Third, efficiency. Fourth, security. And fifth, scalability. And now I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Sean, who's going to go through the DOME system in a little bit more depth.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So as stated, DOME is an acronym. It stands for Data Operations for Managing Ethics. And this is not only important in terms of understanding that we are focusing on management and data operations in an ethical framework, but also important to understand that DOME is exactly what we mean by this acronym. It is a protection. It is a real shield we can put over consumer data, so they feel secure when they log on to something like Facebook. This is not only a legal and it is not only a very legal and ethical system, but it also is very streamlined in terms of making it simple for the consumer, making it simple for Facebook, and essentially allowing the data industry to have a leg up from where it currently is. So the ranking is on 1 to 5 stars. Essentially, it's with poor transparency, history of breaches, scandal, and insecurity, representing the 1-star side. And then 5 stars being a transparent, policy-focused, and really a very legal-based system in which consumer data isn't sold frequently without permissions. So this is a rating which Goldfinch is creating as an outside consulting firm, which Facebook can pay the Goldfinch Corporation, as well as these other companies can help cover those costs to ensure that full knowledge and transparency is brought about for the data industry as a whole. So now the team, this is how DOME works in terms of 3 different segments. So the team itself, obviously you have one team lead. This is for, come from a business management perspective, someone to really supervise and understand the different aspects of it. And then after that team lead, there's 10 data and computer science professionals. These are people, these are people who have experienced the industry, who understand everything about computer science, who understand the specifics of how data is being transferred. And also they have experience in their respective industries, whether they work for companies such as Facebook, or they had some sort of technical knowledge from working in the military, at universities, that sort of thing. And these people are the backbone. This is the real heart of the team, because data security starts with people who have knowledge about the data itself. So moving on, there's 3 privacy law experts, and these people, as stated, are upholding the legal side of things. As stated, the legal side has been increasingly more interest to the government as there's increased regulations and understanding that you can really be sued over a collapse of consumer security. And then there's 3 business analysts who are looking from a real technical side of the business world, people who have experience within HR, who can look at employees and whether or not there are disagreements over how Facebook or how these companies, such as Cambridge Analytica, for example, are operating within an ethical business standpoint. And then there's 3 financial and accounting analysts, and these people are looking for discrepancies specifically with their chosen companies. They're looking to see if there's any sort of accounting messes, or if they're doing very clean work with ensuring that they're paying taxes, things like that. And overall, this team will find a holistic study of the chosen companies. So now the process. So one member of each specialty, as stated on the left-hand side, will visit the firm in person. And for example, if I was to go back to Cambridge Analytica, these people would go straight into the offices themselves. They would meet with kind of the leadership, and they would also meet with engineers and data science scientists on a low level to ensure that there's no sort of kind of discrepancy versus what the board says about their company and the engineers say about the company. And once those people are able to get a grasp, I guess, of the in-person work, they'll then be able to bring kind of the data and systems that they gained knowledge about back with them to Goldfinch. And at Goldfinch, there's the entire team can work together to create this rating. And it's a very, very concise, very clear rating, which will be created within 1 to 5 business days. And this rating can actually have implications not only for that company in terms of their success, but also for Facebook. For example, Facebook will be able to see a landmine like Cambridge Analytica before it starts. So now, once the process is completed, the team will have a chance to actually publish this rating on Goldfinch's website and have a chance to establish this throughout the data industry, so people can know whether or not this rating's actually going to affect their use of consumer data. So, for example, if this rating is published by Goldfinch and Facebook is looking for a new company in which to do analysis with, and they're really concerned about providing ethical practices from legal to business to financial aspects, they'll be able to see with their own eyes which companies are doing it right and which companies are doing wrong and adjust accordingly.
Thanks, Sean. So what makes our solution not just good, but great is that it's sustainable and that it can be applied very easily and very seamlessly. So with the DOME system, we'll be able to make it so that ethics is baked into the architecture of Facebook itself. So we decided to break the ethics argument into 4 key blocks: subsidiarity, human dignity, justice, and truth. So to start with subsidiarity in this sense means to empower those that are in the best positions to make decisions, people who are proximate to the matter at hand and know what needs to be done to have the best job, know what needs to be done to ensure that the best job is done. So we discussed earlier that government is not always an effective mechanism for change, not because officials necessarily have bad intentions or because they're incompetent, but essentially by designating government to enforce regulation, you're giving the responsibility to someone who's detached from the affairs of the company, who may not be informed enough to make decisions with efficiency and company processes in mind. With our proposed system, as Sean explained in a bit, the data scientists, the engineers, the computer scientists, lawyers, etc., who we are deploying to create this system and collaborate with Facebook, they'll be the ones that are able to ensure that the best strategies for Facebook are enacted going forward. They'll be familiar with the architecture of the company, and they'll be empowered to take this responsibility into their own hands. The second part that we want to mention is human dignity. So the principle of human dignity comes down to treating all people with respect. So when Facebook says, yes, we realize that consumer data is making us a lot of money, whether it's through selling that data, letting other firms access that data, they know that the control to this data gives them power, and it's this power that's allowed Facebook to become as big as it is today. But with that being said, Facebook needs to be responsible over this power. And in a world where data has become, in a sense, a form of currency, the extension of the consumer is that data. So data that's obtained in a nefarious manner, that is not properly protected, is granted access to by nefarious actors, in a sense, is not secure. So companies need to pledge to have consumers first and ensure that their data is secure. Thirdly, justice. So businesses are powerful entities. Corporations especially have a lot of people behind them at any given time, ensuring that everything is happening as it should. But companies like Facebook, Google, and Amazon are really big, so big to the point that if the average consumer feels that a company has committed a wrongdoing, then a lot of time it's hard to hold these companies accountable. So technology has become really advanced to the point that it's kind of hard to, like I said, hold these companies accountable. So with the self-regulation process that we're doing, we're going to ensure that companies put consumers first. And finally, with truth, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, as we mentioned earlier, cost Facebook billions of dollars. So the idea with the DOME system is that we're baking in transparency into Facebook architecture itself. So this will ensure that Facebook is being truthful to consumers, and consumers will trust Facebook with their data. Sean?
The key takeaway
Yes,
here
I want
is
to thank everyone. I want to thank everyone today for being with us, and we just want to stress again that increased transparency will lead to increased consumer trust, which will lead to increased profits for Facebook. And we hope to work with you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You ran your clock right to the end, and you kept my interest for the entire time. I won't take much more of your time offering my suggestions or comments other than I think it was very well done. And we will move into what is the Q&A portion now by the judges. So in any order that you choose, judges, you can start to address your questions directly to the presenters. Lori, you want to go first?
I'll go first. I have a question. So shouldn't consumers at the very beginning have the right to say, I want my data sold or I don't want my data sold? Because isn't that what GDPR really is allowing them to opt in or opt out?
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes. When I log on to Facebook, I provide Facebook with all of this information, personal information, my age, my this, whatever. At that point, shouldn't I be able to tell Facebook, I do not want you to use my information, period?
Mm-hmm.
So I can actually answer that question very concisely, and it comes back to end user agreements. So whether you like it or not, a lot of these agreements, most people don't read them. I would say 99% of the population does not read these agreements, that when you log on to Facebook, when you create an account, that they'll actually have access to that. And there's no sort of magic button where you can say, I want to kind of protect myself from the world, because without those abilities for Facebook to do such a thing, they're not able to, I guess, work and advertise their profits, or to generate profits through advertising. And the real solution to this isn't just a blanket yes or no on whether or not that information is being used. Because whether you like it or not, whether you're using Facebook or Google or any sort of entity online, that information is out there. And the question is, how is it being managed? And that's what Goldfinch can really find a way to trim, to make sure that once the information is out there, which it inevitably is, because these end user agreements allow for that, and by not signing them, you essentially can't use that product. We believe that you can actually find the gaps within the usage and management of the data in the next step.
Okay, thank you.
I'll go ahead. I have a question. I thought you guys did a great job, but here at Facebook, we've gone through a couple of not great outward-facing events, and one thing we're always trying to do is improve our image. But one of the things that we want to be able to do is have some information that we can share in certain situations. So how do you guys factor into your rating system if there are emergencies or if there are threats online where we want to be able to share information with authorities, or if Facebook wants to be able to share information in a positive way, but still we may not be getting consumer consent in a situation where it has to happen quickly? How does something like that factor into the rating?
Yeah, so I think Elizabeth actually answered that slightly. The court case she was talking about was, Elizabeth, you can factor this in, but I know right now, I believe Facebook is regulating, and they're actually taking down the anti-coronavirus protests for people who actually want to go back to work and want to end the quarantine. So they're actually taking down the information. So it's applicable now. I think you're asking about criminal cases. It sounds like you're asking
Could be, yeah.
if someone's threatening, any school-related thing, anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
When can Facebook violate data? Elizabeth, do you want to talk about the court case you just talked about, as well as a couple others?
Sure. So really the significant advancements in kind of defining privacy has been very careful by the Supreme Court. So I listed a few court cases there. But basically in all of the more modern court cases which have been addressing data privacy and protection, it's basically been determined that consumer privacy is kind of related to your data. So of course there's a protection against self-incrimination, all these sorts of things. If it's a public post, let's say, and authorities can easily see it if it's on like a public account, I think that kind of what we've seen is that can be used in some sense to kind of mark that as, a potential threat and can be marked by law enforcement. But again, that's public data. If it's private data, we still have laws against self-incrimination, and that has been shown to extend to, data that's either on a cell phone, a GPS, whatever the technology is. So I think, in the future, the Supreme Court will probably face more cases that are going to define the finer lines around that. But I think it is really going to depend on the context of whether this falls in line of self-incrimination, where this is, protected private data, or whether it's public data that can easily be viewed by law enforcement. Because they already kind of go through an attempt to kind of flag people who give warning signs. And I think that's something we've seen with some of these attacks on schools and things like that. It's just unfortunate, as to whether how much they monitor, how much can be done with that information to really stop anything from happening.
I think the short answer is it actually depends. There was a recent, I don't believe it was a case, but there was a recent issue where a family purchased a couple pressure cookers online, and that was flagged as a potential terrorist threat, and authorities went to their house and actually, searched their house to identify any threats. And it was seen as a violation of privacy. They weren't going to do anything harmful with them.
And very quickly, one other caveat is the fact that there is also precedent already decided. It's included with eminent domain for the good of the public. For example, in the 2015 San Bernardino attack, the usage of an iPhone, basically there was an iPhone found by the two attackers after they had committed a mass shooting. And a federal court ruled against Apple because Apple didn't believe that it should be made to unlock that iPhone. But basically, the government said that in the case of any sort of criminal entity that poses a threat to the rest of the world, that they believe that that information should be public. The good news with Facebook, though, is that that sort of information is only going to be used for the greater good. In terms of people, the average consumer, the average person shouldn't be worried about their violation, about their data being violated, because these are only very specific cases in which a crime was committed.
Thank you.
Laurie,
Yes, I can go. So thank you for walking through kind of the structure of your dome concept. It was very helpful to kind of see the process that you would go through, the makeup of the team, what the team would do with the data, and how that would be presented to the client. What I thought was interesting was that as you walk through who would make up the team, I actually didn't see anything explicit about someone, a representative from ethics. So it looks like it's very deeply rooted in compliance. So obviously tons of expertise, data and computer science professionals, privacy law experts, analysts, but I don't see any representation from someone who's looking at the picture or providing a bit of a different perspective. And so I guess my question is why is that?
Yeah, I can actually answer that very, very concisely, because we thought about that. We thought about, well, why not just have someone for ethics? And the answer is that every single one of these people should already have a background and be rooted in ethics, because we don't really like the idea of trying to separate business and the idea of compliance from ethics itself. We believe that every step of the way, whether you are a lawyer or whether you're working in human resources or whether you're working in the data itself, that ethics should always be on your mind. And there's different aspects of that, but at the end of the day, each of these people within their training through Goldfinch have an idea about what ethics is in terms of, is this right? Is this, for example, if you're a finance person, is this going to be something like Arthur Andersen, Enron, kind of covering up? Whether or not you're a data person, is this going to lead to something like Cambridge Analytica? Because those problems didn't start necessarily with legal issues. They started with a breach of ethics, and it's the fact that there's people in compliance who were trying to say, well, I know what I'm doing, and why should I bring ethics into it? That should be someone else's job. But kind of we have a revolutionary step to make sure that every person on the team is working at all times, not only with their given training, but also with their understanding of what business ethics is, as stated throughout our presentation.
I'd like to expound a little bit on what Laurie asked, because I think that's very pertinent. These people may have ethics embedded in what they do, but how do you see them furthering that to embed it in the individuals within Facebook, and any sort of training and compliance that the Facebook folks have to do to be more in touch with the ethical side of what's happening? I see that there's a legal there, but one of the things that concerns me as a member of the board is that many times, as you said, John, ethics is something that goes just a little beyond what's just legal. So how do you propose them getting this inculcated into the culture of Facebook?
So it starts, you're right, it starts from a cultural aspect. That's something that when we were studying the Cambridge Analytica scandal, especially, was an issue brought up with Mark Zuckerberg. When Mark Zuckerberg had to, I guess, appear in front of Congress and explain, he was focusing from a compliance aspect. And the worry that comes with bringing someone just specifically for ethics on is because there can be a competition. There can be competition against what's good for the company and what's good for our ethics as presented to the general public. And we want to really change the whole data industry from the ground up in terms of making sure that every person, whether or not you're Mark Zuckerberg or whether you're not someone in security or someone who's just working in an engineering aspect, that each person should be brought with a certain amount of training about ethical practices. And our idea behind that is not to say, hey, let's separate ethics from compliance, but rather to kind of bring them together and to show that really building ethics into a company shouldn't be something that can decrease profits, but rather should be shown that when you have compliance rooted in ethics, that will actually bring profits for the company overall. And you won't have something like Cambridge Analytica, and you won't have something like Mark Zuckerberg having to appear in front of Congress. So I think implementation, as stated through Elizabeth and Vincent's examples, should be focused on the, I guess, combination of them both. So again, Lori, I really appreciate that that kind of addressing of the fact that kind of ethics doesn't seem to be one of the positions there. But I guess our hope is to actually make sure that people in, no matter what position they're in, will always be thinking about that.
Yeah, and I appreciate your response. And I get where you're coming from. The thing is that I think what reinforces the fact that there isn't an ethics person is that the process seems separated from the ethical framework. And so having it on, I mean, I'm not saying you should put it on the same slide, but it sounds like there's the process and then there's this framework that kind of sits on top of it. And I think from an ethics perspective, if it was so embedded into the process, I would see that a little bit more integrated. And so when you talk about how DOME works, you talk about one member sits on each of the each specialty visits, you talk about data, you talk about the analysis, and so it seems very process-based. I'm not seeing where in the process the ethical framework fits, and the ethical framework sounds fantastic. I think it was very eloquently described. I'm just not seeing how that actually comes together. So the fact that there isn't someone on the team, and then the fact that the framework kind of, at least it was presented separately, I think that's where I'm kind of seeing the disconnect, despite your intention.
Yeah, I think to answer the original question.
No, I was just saying 5 more minutes of Q&A, please.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
go ahead.
I think to answer the original question was that I think from a top-down approach is the best approach for ethics from Facebook's perspective. What I mean by this is oftentimes in companies, you find that the culture of the company is shaped by the CEO, whether it's like the CEO's mannerisms, whether they're a very antsy person, more laid back person, the culture of the company is shaped by them. With this, I think a discussion has to happen clearly between the team and the CEO. There has to be these sort of discussions, these sort of boardroom, these conferences between them explaining, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, here's how it's going to benefit you. This whole system's actually upheld by incentives. Of course, the legal aspect with tax breaks is important, but it's upheld by incentives to act ethically. And through these incentives, the DOME system is going to take care of this team on this page, And through those conversations, those boardroom meetings with the team and the CEO and the board of directors, that's where you're seeing the ethics transfer kind of from the team to Facebook.
So I'm kind of confused about with your, I don't know how much time we have left. I'm kind of confused about your kind of inquiry into the implementation process, because I guess one of the big things we analyzed when we began this project was that we've seen huge developments such as GDPR. We've seen huge cases such as Cambridge Analytica, where companies such as Facebook have lost a lot of money due to compliance and the bad press of Cambridge Analytica. They lost a lot of their user base. So the idea with that was that Facebook is going to lose money in the long term anyway. So the idea to get ahead of the curve now before they incur those future losses.
Yes, and one final thing about that as well. As I stated, there's a person in charge, the leader, and that's someone who, again, as I said, supervising, ensuring that they're doing what they need to do, and that starts with ethics. So as long as that supervisor is showing each step of the way, holding each member of the different specializations accountable to ethical development, I believe we definitely have room for improvement, but also the ability to strive to make sure that each step away has an ethical framework in mind.
I would like to thank you for the questions and for the responses. This time we'd like to take about 10 minutes just giving some general feedback to the team that would possibly help them with their presentation going forward in the 10-minute and a 90-second presentation. I will just lead off by saying that a couple of times I felt that the presentation was more of a sales presentation than a problem and solution presentation. You got around and you did talk about the problem and solution, so remember to highlight that. And as Lori said, don't lose sight of the fact that this is an ethics competition. And as you move to the 10-minute and the 90-second presentations, ethics is going to be the primary focal point. And what I would suggest that you do, as Lori brought up about your ethics being included, is to continue to remind us that you're addressing those ethical issues. And when you talk about the supervisors having ethical training, many times the ethics violations start below the supervisor level. And so you may need to talk about how this is going to be addressed at every level. I love the idea that you say it's a top down from the CEO downward. And I'll stop at that.
I have one comment, is that whatever you get Facebook to do, you want this to be standardized so that all companies follow a similar approach or framework. Is that correct?
Yes, we actually didn't even talk about the scalability. We were going to touch upon it. We expected to in the questions. So from this, there other companies obviously could apply this Goldfinch partner solution. That's why we chose Facebook, because they're so heavily based on data collection. There's other issues about data collection with other companies that are very important. Just a couple of examples are Waze, Google Maps, and Tesla.
Right.
So we can apply it to them.
And because my question is, wouldn't it be great if Dome could develop a common set of ethical standards agreed upon that all companies should follow, and then you as Dome could go out and measure how well each individual company is measuring up or fulfilling those particular standards, you know?
Well, how do you measure ethics on a quantitative basis?
Well, it's the same way that companies measure internal control measures. That's what auditing firms do, is they go into a company and look at a company's internal control systems and say, yes, they fulfill these requirements, or no, they don't fulfill these requirements, you know?
Yeah.
And also, again, if you want a system that's going to be consistent across companies, then there is going to have to be some way of measuring whether this company is doing the same good job as another company is doing the same good job.
Yeah, and I think for quantifying that, we spoke upon it with the DOME system. I think it's how they collect data, where that data goes, who it's sold to, if it is sold to third parties, and that sort of thing. So it's not just the collection, it's also the transition from their databases into other databases, third parties.
Mhm.
I'm
And
happy to.
also, additionally, the system that we're proposing is inherently, like, it takes these things into consideration. So the point that Sean made earlier was that, or I made earlier actually, is that ethics is baked into the system itself. So the idea that you don't need to necessarily hire an ethics compliance officer on site because, oh, excuse me, sorry. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry about that.
Oh no, I was just going to give my feedback. I think content-wise, I think the other judges, I share some of their thoughts. What I'll say is, as far as the presentation, what I really liked is that it never felt like any of you were reading to us. It felt like it was presented in a little more conversational as much as it can be. And what I'll say is, especially with the challenge of this format where you guys are not next to each other and you're not next to us. And so what I'm looking at is a big screen, which is mostly the presentation with everyone's videos over to the side. It felt like, it didn't ever feel like I was just sitting, listening to a recording, which I think is really good. I don't know how that translates to the 10-minute and the 90-second, but if you guys can keep that as much as possible, where you are just delivering the information as you would normally speak to each other in a conversational kind of manner. I thought that was really good. I think the topic is interesting, but any interesting topic can be a boring presentation if done poorly. So I think you guys did a really good job of kind of keeping us engaged as that went along. So I'd say for the next couple of rounds, as much as you can, keep that kind of, it doesn't have to be so familiar that it's, a couple of friends having a beer, but it could be familiar enough that, I don't know as much about a certain topic, but now I feel like I do because you guys were able to explain it pretty well.
Thank you.
I really liked your slides.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What do you think we could have identified better in the slides to make it easier for you to understand?
You had all of this, you were thinking about all of this really in relationship to Facebook. And I think that's good because Facebook really needs to take a lead in this manner. But at the same time, Facebook has to, I go back to this concept of having a common set of standards by which you can measure all companies' handling of data, Because data privacy is an issue with MasterCard, with Visa, with Target, with all of these companies that have had hacks and things like that. So we have to be able to tell every company that DOME looks at, these are the standards that we want you to follow.
And I would chime in by saying that if you can establish those kinds of standards, then you may very well find that even though you don't want the government regulation there, that the government will basically sanction what you have established as those standards and saying, yes, we see these as what are reputable standards that we would be willing to look at across industries to see if they're meeting them.
Because right now, the reason why GDPR came out in Europe is because there was no common way for companies to handle their data. Now, GDPR is now saying, here are the common set of rules that every company must follow. Do you like GDPR and what is required of companies who do business in Europe in relationship to GDPR? I asked that of the team.
What was the final question?
Do you like the requirements of GDPR? Do you think all companies in the US, for example, should follow the requirements of GDPR?
Yes, so privacy has always been an issue, more so the United States, just because we're so inclined to not give up any personal freedoms. To speak upon that a little bit more personally, we had a South Korean exchange student, which has been South Korea has been the best example for containing the coronavirus. How did they do that? They did that by violating some privacy. So if someone had the coronavirus, they would actually ask that person where they've been, what people they've hung around in order to limit that. That would never fly in the United States. Do I think some of these policies would not fly in the United States? I think so, because we are so bent on protecting our privacy. As to what certain policies would not fly, I'm not exactly sure in terms of the breakdown. But I think in terms of Europe versus the United States, or United States versus the rest of the world, we are more bent on privacy than anyone else.
Be careful using that example, because if we go to contact tracing, that's exactly what we're going to do.
Yeah.
They're talking about adding as many as 100,000 people to do contact tracing. And that's exactly what they did in South Korea. So just be careful of using that example.
Yeah, I understand. But in terms of what you're talking about, GDPR specifically, one of the things that it did was disallow it heavily regulated any transfer of data outside the EU. So that would be any countries which are not in the EU all of a sudden do not have access to those data. For example, if you're an American company that wanted access to some sort of European data for consulting purposes, that was automatically basically impossible through a system like that. And we don't believe that something like that would go over very well, because a lot of Americans, for example, with their data, the United States, just like Europe, a very diverse group of people who have business contacts in other countries. And kind of having those contacts, and especially in the data industry, a number of companies have to outsource and their labor and a lot of their abilities to other countries such as India, for example, which is a massive market for being able to analyze and compute consumer data. And we don't believe that something like GDPR would be fully operational within the United States, considering there's such a strong network in other countries with data usage. But we do think that having a self-regulating system like the DOME system aims to be is much more clear and will be much more trusted by the average consumer.
Let me move towards wrapping up, and I'd just like to go through the judges one more time and see if you have anything that you would like to recommend as further feedback to the team. Michael, would you start?
No feedback. I thought it was good. As I said, I really enjoyed your slides. They were clear, they were large, they really conveyed what complemented what you were saying as opposed to being a substitute. So I thought your presentation in conjunction with the slides was very good.
Laurie?
Yes, I'd also agree with that. It really was very seamless. The transitions between the speakers, I thought was really good. Just in terms of, I guess, one thing that I did notice was during the stages of implementation, you talked about the government tracking data, and I know we just touched upon that a little bit with contact tracing. That was the one concern that I had, that I wouldn't necessarily see that as a benefit, and there are probably certain populations wouldn't see that as a benefit, allowing the government to track data. So that was one thing that I would just note. But just overall, I thought it was, you guys did a really fantastic job.
David?
Yeah, I think there's so much great information here. I think one of the hardest things is going to be, how do you pare that down to the next amount of time? So I think the challenge is going to be picking the most important things that you can touch on in enough time to get your point across, without, really leaving out any big things. So I think that's one of the challenges. I do think, I don't know that this really came up as much, and maybe it doesn't fit in a shorter presentation, because I think you guys have enough that you could really go on for like another half hour, but maybe identifying more at-risk populations. I know that when we're talking about consumer data, we're talking about all consumer data. But if you can find a way to address where there might be a more vulnerable population than others, or a group that might get hurt more than others, that might be a way to sell that to a company who values, their public image. If you can say, we are really good at protecting these people who don't otherwise get additional protections, that might be a good, again, that's a sales pitch. So if you're trying to, sell this actual product, but I think that might be an interesting thing to look at.
I agree with the comments. First and foremost, that you all were very professional. You held my interest, and I'm really proud to say that, because I'm one who can lose interest easily. But I stayed with you the whole time, and you may not have heard this in the earlier part, but you will hear it when you do your 10-minute and your 90-second presentation. Just like I read to you about what this 30-minute presentation was, in the 10-minute and the 90 seconds, it will tell you that they have asked you to speak only about the ethical aspects. So in terms of trying to pare it down, that gives you something instantly that you can start to focus on in terms of paring your information down. I think you had a wealth of information here. It was very good information, presented very well, and I wish you luck going forward. Thank you again so very, very much for agreeing to participate and taking those added steps to do this. I think that it will be a benefit to you and your professional careers going forward. If you have some desire to want to chat with the other judges, I don't know whether they have another presentation that's about to start, but please let Liam know and he can set that up. I do have another presentation that I got to get ready to move right into. So thank you very much and good luck going forward.